John Locke is often presented as the optimistic alternative to Hobbes. Where Hobbes sees fear, conflict, and mutual distrust, Locke sees rational individuals capable of cooperation. Where Hobbes believes strong authority is needed to prevent chaos, Locke argues that human beings possess natural rights that exist before governments. Life, liberty, and property do not come from rulers. They belong to people simply because they are human. This idea became one of the foundations of modern liberal democracy. The language of individual rights, limited government, consent of the governed, constitutional restraints on power, all owe an enormous debt to Locke. His influence stretches from the Enlightenment to modern democracies, from revolutions to human rights movements. And there's a reason his philosophy became so successful. Locke starts from a much more attractive picture of human nature. People are not naturally trapped in a war of all against all. They are capable of recognizing moral obligations. They can understand reason. They can respect the rights of others. Even before formal governments exist, individuals possess enough rationality to cooperate and live according to natural law. Compared to Hobbes, this sounds far more hopeful. And in many ways, it is. Human beings clearly possess capacities for trust, cooperation, and moral judgment. Most people do not spend their lives attacking everyone around them. Families function. Communities function. Trade functions. Friendships function. Locke recognizes dimensions of human behavior that Hobbes often neglects. This is why Locke feels intuitively correct to many people. He captures something admirable about human beings. We are not merely creatures of fear. We can reason about fairness. We can recognize duties. We can restrain ourselves even when selfish behavior might be advantageous. Civilization depends on these capacities. But this is also where Locke begins simplifying human nature, because he places extraordinary confidence in reason. For Locke, people generally possess the ability to recognize natural rights and understand moral limits. Rational individuals can appreciate that others have legitimate claims just as they do. They can see why theft, violence, and arbitrary domination are wrong. They can grasp principles that make peaceful coexistence possible. The problem is that real human beings rarely operate as rationally as Locke assumes. People do not merely reason. They rationalize. They do not simply seek truth. They seek outcomes they already desire. They do not approach moral questions as neutral observers. They approach them through emotion, identity, loyalty, fear, ambition, pride, resentment, and self-interest. This is one of the biggest discoveries of modern psychology. Human beings are astonishingly good at convincing themselves that what benefits them is also what is right. They interpret fairness differently depending on whether they gain or lose. They apply moral principles selectively. They often believe they are acting rationally while being guided by motives they barely understand. Locke's theory struggles with this reality. His vision assumes that reason can act as a stable foundation for political order. But reason is frequently recruited into emotional battles rather than standing above them. People use intelligence not only to discover truth, but also to defend tribal identities, justify desires, and protect existing beliefs. This makes human nature far messier than Locke's framework suggests. There's also a deeper problem hidden inside his concept of natural rights. Locke speaks as though individuals can clearly recognize these rights through reason itself. Life, liberty, and property appear almost self-evident, but history suggests otherwise. Human societies have disagreed dramatically about what rights exist, who possesses them, and how they should be balanced against one another. What seems obvious in one era appears controversial in another. What one culture calls a fundamental right, another may barely recognize. This does not necessarily mean rights are fictional, but it does suggest that moral reasoning is far more complicated than Locke often assumes. People do not simply discover universal truths and agree upon them. They argue, reinterpret, negotiate, and fight over them for centuries. That reality should make us cautious about any philosophy that places too much confidence in human rationality, because the human mind is not merely a truth-seeking machine. It is also a self-serving machine. And once you recognize that, Locke's picture of humanity starts looking less like a realistic portrait and more like an idealized version of what human beings might be on their best days. The deeper problem with Locke emerges when his faith in reason expands into a faith in individual judgment. Locke believes human beings are generally capable of recognizing their rights, understanding moral limits, and acting according to principles that others could reasonably accept. This assumption sits at the heart of his political philosophy. If people are rational enough to govern themselves, then government can remain limited. Authority does not need absolute power because citizens possess enough moral competence to manage much of their own lives. It is an attractive vision. In many ways, it is the vision that modern liberal societies still operate under. Citizens are expected to make informed decisions, evaluate evidence, participate in public life, and respect the rights of others. Democracy itself depends on the belief that ordinary individuals are capable of exercising judgment without constant supervision. But Locke may have underestimated how difficult that actually is. Human beings do not merely possess reason. They possess competing desires, emotional loyalties, unconscious biases, and social identities that constantly influence what reason ends up serving. The same intelligence that can discover truth can also defend falsehood. The same rational capacity that can promote justice can justify cruelty. This creates a problem Locke never fully resolves. How do you build a political system around rational individuals when rationality itself is so easily manipulated by emotion? Modern psychology has repeatedly demonstrated that people are far less objective than they imagine. We seek evidence that confirms existing beliefs. We notice facts that support our identity and ignore those that threaten it. We interpret events differently depending on which side we already favor. Reason often functions less like a judge and more like a lawyer, constructing arguments for conclusions that emotion reached first. That reality makes Locke's picture of human nature seem unusually optimistic. Not naive exactly, but optimistic, because he assumes that individuals can reliably recognize their own interests while also respecting the rights of others. Yet history suggests that people frequently redefine rights whenever doing so benefits them. Entire populations have convinced themselves that domination was justice, that privilege was fairness, and that exploitation was natural. The problem was not a lack of intelligence. Many of these societies contained highly intelligent people. The problem was that intelligence alone did not guarantee moral clarity. Locke tends to treat reason as a stabilizing force. In practice, reason often amplifies existing desires rather than correcting them. Smart people are not necessarily less biased than others. In some cases, they become better at defending their biases because they possess more sophisticated arguments. This has enormous consequences for politics. If citizens are less rational than Locke assumes, then disagreements become much harder to resolve through reasoned discussion alone. Public debate stops looking like a search for truth and starts looking like a competition between identities, interests, and narratives. People are not simply exchanging arguments. They're defending worlds they're emotionally invested in. Locke's framework struggles to account for this level of tribal behavior. He writes as though individuals encounter one another primarily as rational agents. But in reality, people encounter one another as members of families, communities, religions, nations, ideological groups, and cultural traditions. These affiliations shape judgment long before pure reason enters the conversation. There is also a deeper issue hidden inside Locke's emphasis on individual rights. Rights are essential because they protect people from arbitrary power. Few ideas in political philosophy have been more important. But Locke sometimes speaks as though individuals can be understood independently from the communities that shape them. This is where his theory begins simplifying human nature in another way. Human beings are not isolated units who occasionally form relationships. They are relational creatures from the beginning. Language, values, identity, morality, and even the capacity for reason develop through social life. A person learns how to think through interaction with others long before they become an independent individual. Locke's philosophy often starts with the individual and works outward toward society. But many aspects of human nature work in the opposite direction. People become individuals through society. They do not emerge fully formed before it. This matters because it challenges one of the central assumptions behind modern liberal thought. If human beings are deeply shaped by communities, then rights alone may not explain what makes societies healthy. People also need belonging, shared values, trust, cultural continuity, and forms of common purpose that cannot be reduced to individual freedom. Locke understands liberty brilliantly. What he understands less clearly is dependence. Human beings depend on relationships far more than his philosophy sometimes acknowledges. They depend on traditions they did not create, languages they did not invent, institutions they did not build, and communities that provide meaning beyond individual choice. By focusing so heavily on rational individuals with natural rights, Locke captures something enormously important, but he risks overlooking something equally important. Human beings are not merely rational owners of rights. They are emotional, social, tribal, dependent, and often irrational creatures trying to navigate a world far more psychologically complicated than reason alone can explain. The final weakness in Locke's philosophy is that he mistakes a desirable vision of human beings for a complete description of human beings. His theory works beautifully when people are rational, self-restrained, morally serious, and willing to respect the rights of others. In many situations, human beings are capable of exactly that. They cooperate, compromise, follow rules, and recognize obligations that extend beyond their own interests. That is why Locke remains so influential. He sees something genuinely noble in human nature. Unlike Hobbes, who begins with fear and conflict, Locke begins with the possibility of reason. He believes people can govern themselves without constant coercion. He believes individuals possess dignity that does not depend on rulers granting it. He believes political authority should be limited because human beings are not merely subjects to be controlled, but persons with rights that deserve protection. These ideas transformed the modern world, and rightly so. The problem is not that Locke sees too much good in people. The problem is that he often sees too little complexity. Because human beings are not consistently rational creatures who occasionally become irrational. More often, they are emotional creatures who occasionally become rational enough to correct themselves. Reason matters enormously, but it exists inside minds shaped by fear, pride, envy, loyalty, ambition, status, resentment, and countless unconscious influences. Locke tends to underestimate how powerful those forces can become. A person may sincerely believe they are defending justice when they are really defending their group. They may think they are following reason when they are following emotion. They may speak the language of rights while selectively applying those rights only to people they already sympathize with. This is not a rare failure. It is one of the most common patterns in human history. Again and again, societies have proclaimed universal principles while excluding large numbers of people from those principles. They have defended liberty while restricting it. They have celebrated equality while preserving hierarchy. They have appealed to reason while being driven by prejudice. The individuals involved were not always evil. Many genuinely believed they were acting rationally. That is exactly the point. Human beings are remarkably skilled at confusing justification with understanding. This creates a challenge for Locke's entire political vision. If people are less objective than they imagine, then rights and institutions cannot rely solely on rational recognition. They require cultural habits, moral education, social trust, and shared norms strong enough to support them, even when reason alone proves insufficient. Locke acknowledges some of this, but not enough. His philosophy often treats rights as if they can stand independently of the social conditions that sustain them. Yet rights survive only when enough people believe in them, teach them, defend them, and transmit them across generations. They are not merely discovered through reason. They are maintained through culture. This is where Locke's individualism begins to show its limitations. By focusing so heavily on the independent individual, he sometimes overlooks how deeply human beings depend on one another. We inherit languages we did not create, moral frameworks we did not invent, communities we did not build, traditions we did not design. Even our ability to reason develops through relationships with others. The isolated individual at the center of Locke's philosophy is therefore less real than he appears. No human being begins life as a fully formed, rights-bearing, rational agent. Every person emerges through networks of dependence. Family, community, education, culture, and history shape the very capacities that later make freedom possible. This does not invalidate Locke's emphasis on rights. It simply means rights alone cannot explain everything important about human life. People need freedom, but they also need belonging. They need autonomy, but they also need connection. They need rights, but they also need responsibilities, loyalties, and shared purposes that bind individuals into something larger than themselves. Locke's philosophy captures the first half of this truth brilliantly. The second half remains underdeveloped. That is why his ideas feel both powerful and incomplete. He correctly understood that governments should not treat people as property. He correctly defended individual liberty against arbitrary power. He correctly recognized that human beings possess a dignity that political authority must respect. These achievements are enormous. But he also imagined human beings as more rational, more self-transparent, and more independent than they really are. And once that assumption enters political theory, it creates expectations that reality struggles to satisfy. People do not simply follow reason. They follow identities. They do not simply pursue truth. They pursue meaning. They do not simply exercise rights. They seek belonging. Locke saw humanity at its most reasonable and built a philosophy around that image. The result was one of the most influential visions of freedom ever created. But it was also a vision that sometimes mistook humanity's highest potential for its everyday reality. And that is why Locke's account of human nature remains inspiring, optimistic, and deeply influential, while also feeling far simpler than the complicated creatures we actually are.